Hey friends, before the video begins, I just wanted to introduce you to a new channel called Scary Interesting. It's hosted by Sean and he covers a wide variety of terrifying topics. I'm going to let him speak for himself, but you should definitely check it out.
Hello everyone, my name is Sean and I'm the host of the channel Scary Interesting on YouTube. I tell scary and interesting stories of all kinds, including cave exploring and mountain climbing disasters, insane survival stories, and strange and horrible fates. In particular, my goal is to tell them in a vivid and engaging way so that whether you're watching the content on screen or just listening, you're totally immersed in the story. If that sounds like the type of thing you'd be interested in, I'd love for you to come check out my channel. Thank you all so much for listening, and hopefully I will see you in the next one.
A few years back, me and an old hiking buddy reunited to try and complete one of the scrambles on the Heart Mountain Horseshoe Trail here in Alberta. It had been a while since we'd been out together, and sadly we found we weren't nearly as fit as we used to be. So after hitting the wall fairly early on, we decided that we'd stick to some of the easier trails and give some encouragement to the other climbers we passed on our way. Anyway, so after walking for a few hours, we settled in for lunch, then decided to head back while we still had daylight on our side. Then on our way back, I remember seeing a climbing shoe in the creek and thinking, dang, someone's having a bad day. I picked it up to show my buddy, only when I looked over to him, he's as white as a sheet and looking a little further downstream. I have to climb a little to see what he's looking at, but when I get eyes on it, I suddenly understand why he looks so frightened. Further downstream, there are two hikers lying in the shallow water, rope and harnesses still attached, but very obviously dead from how broken and twisted up their bodies were. The worst thing was, I suddenly realized that I'd seen the exact same couple climbing maybe 2 or 3 hours before. They were having the best time, making their calls, scaling parts of the rock face that me and my buddy could only dream of at the ages we were at. It was surreal, horrifying, and heartbreaking all at once. They must have slipped and fallen while we were having lunch, so while we were all busy filling our stomachs with the sandwiches and donuts that we'd brought, they were tumbling to their deaths just a few 100 meters away. I remember wondering, why didn't you scream? And having that question haunt me for weeks afterwards. I always figured that I'd be so scared that I'd scream the entire mountain down if I ever felt like that, but the pair of them somehow managed to stay totally quiet for the whole fall. Maybe they hit their heads early on the way down and were unconscious or something, but I don't know. Another part of me thinks that it was just acceptance or something, or pride that made them shove their fear down so they could die with dignity. Then right as I'm totally absorbed by the horror of what I was looking at, I see this young family heading up the trail behind us. I rushed up onto the path and try to compose myself as I approach, greeting them warmly before asking if I can talk to them for a moment. They seem a little confused, and the kids are asking, "Who's that, Mommy?" But I managed to give the dad a look which told them something was horribly wrong without freaking the kids out too much. I then invited the guy to walk up the trail with me while he has the good sense to keep his wife and kids back in safety and ignorance. Then as soon as he sees the bodies, he tells me he'll make a stop at the ranger's cabin on the way down to let them know what's happened, while me and my buddy stayed with the bodies to guide the rangers and when they showed up. The dad I ran into must have jogged down the mountain as quickly as he could because I heard the sound of an ATV getting louder and louder within a matter of minutes. The ranger had a radio and whatnot, way more powerful than any of our phones, which were basically no good at the altitude we were at. And with that, he was able to call on the relevant authorities before telling us that we were free to leave and thanking us for our time. I sometimes wonder if there was ever a chance of saving them, that maybe if we had been in a certain spot at a certain time, we might have been able to at least stop some bleeding or call in help in time to actually save their lives. Or maybe, with all our experience, we'd have been able to spot them the moment they started pushing themselves a little too far, telling them to slow it down or take a different route or something. But as my buddy said, you can't think in those terms. If you do, it'll drive you crazy. And I already felt on the verge of a nervous breakdown after seeing the condition their poor bodies were in. After that, we took another long break from hiking, and when we finally got back to it last year, after a lot of the restrictions were relaxed, we certainly didn't go back to Heart Mountain. Way too many bad memories there to go back anytime soon. Me and my buddies are huge into hiking, and although we don't go so much anymore, we used to get at least 1 or 2 trips in every summer, heading out to various bucket list hiking spots all over the US. For the most part, the scariest thing to happen to us was having to take those outside poops, which, believe me, can be truly terrifying sometimes when you don't have the right kind of tree to balance yourself on. But this one time, we did find something that seriously creeped us all out, and that I find myself thinking about every so often. Even all these years later, it still sends shivers down my spine whenever I think about it. This happened in Yellowstone about 8 years ago, and after setting up camp on some lower terrain near a lake, we decided to hike up the mountains at almost 10,500 feet above sea level. The views were incredible, but when we were up there, one of my buddies calls out to come look at something he'd found, and when we do, we see that he's found a horse skull. There was no meat left on it, like the thing was totally bone dry, so we take some pictures of it, joking about how spooky and Old West it looked, then headed back down to camp. We get back to camp, and we're all sweaty, so we decided to head down to the lake to take a dip so we could get clean. We didn't want to see each other all naked and stuff, so we decided to really spread out along the shoreline. It was all ridgy and was dotted with the trees, so if we spread out far enough, we all could get a little privacy so we could strip down and actually get washed properly without worrying about each other seeing our junk. You know how that goes. Then, no sooner had I actually gotten down to my undies, I hear one of the guys shouting like, "You gotta come see this." We all put our books down, and even though some of us were in nothing but our underwear, we all went to check out what one of us had found. I remember having to climb up this little ridge so I could get to where he was calling from, but when I did, the thing was big enough that I didn't have to walk any further to see what he had seen. It was a horse, a dead one, and it was missing its head. As you can guess, we instantly started thinking that the horse skull that we'd found was the one missing from our dead horse. But we basically had to dismiss that idea based on one big reason. Like I said, the horse head was completely clean of any meat, and it was totally dry, whereas the headless horse we found was still rotting. I don't know if there's a way of stripping all the meat from a skull and drying it that fast, but it seemed kind of unlikely that the two were connected. Besides, there's plenty of wildlife around Yellowstone that might rip a stray horse's head off, right? Then suddenly, as we're all stood around gawping at the dead horse, one of us is like, "Dude, is that film?" It was. Near the headless horse was all this old school camera film half buried among the pebbles, and when our buddy picked up a piece of it and held it up to the light, he just let out this slow, freaked out, "Dude." Me and this other buddy of ours scrambled down the ridge to check out what he was seeing, and when he handed me a piece, you could clearly see the negatives were of the headless horse. We spent a whole minute just passing the negatives around in silence, each wondering who would take pictures of something like that, especially with an old school camera when almost everyone under the sun has a zillion megapixel camera phone. Then we started to wonder if the person responsible for taking the pictures was also somehow responsible for actually cutting the horse's head off or something. In which case, how did they get the skull like that? Or maybe they'd done it before and the dry skull was from a completely different occasion. Then it dawned on us. The film had some pebbles over them, and it sure made it look like they were half buried and had been there for a while. But then again, there was hardly any damage or wear or tear to them, so it was more than likely that whoever had left them there had deliberately weighed them down to stop them blowing away or something. But that meant that they'd only been placed there recently, which meant whoever took the pictures might still be around somewhere, maybe even somewhere close. That's when we started to get really spooked, because it was all one thing to find something so weird out there in the middle of nowhere, another thing entirely when we might run into the person that did it. We got out of there pretty fast after that. Even though we were exhausted, we knew better than to hang around the area and take a chance when it'd be much safer to just suck it up and relocate. I don't think that I've been able to sleep knowing some kind of monster was even within a few miles of us. It's definitely the weirdest and creepiest thing we'd ever ran into while out hiking, and although it was just the one time anything like that happened, it certainly made a huge impression on us. After that, we were always very much aware that national parks don't just attract wholesome hiker types. They can attract some pretty messed up people, too. Ever since I was a little girl, geology has always been my one true passion. It started when I was 7 years old, when my dad took me and my brother on a family camping trip to Mammoth Cave National Park in my home state of Kentucky. We didn't go specifically to see the caves, but since it's a huge attraction in the park, enough so that it's named after it, we decided to go along to see what all the fuss was about. And it was a visit that would have a lasting impact on the rest of my life. At first, even though we were on a guided tour accompanied by a park ranger, I was genuinely frightened. We were walking down into this dark, dingy space, unfit for human habitation, and to 7-year-old me, it could have been home to any number of terrifying subterranean monsters. Once I realized that we were just as safe below the earth as we were on the surface, and there were no trolls or ogres living down there, the fear mellowed into a tingling excitement that had a profound effect on me. It felt like we were treading into some hallowed, forbidden space, with the stalactites and stalagmites giving the place an otherworldly, alien feel. And from that day forward, I was hooked. I was that kid in high school who waxed lyrical about their collection of geodes, and every single accessory I owned was bejeweled with either rose quartz, azurite, amethyst, or pyrite. God forbid you complimented me on any of them, because you'd always get an earful of what kind of stone it was, where it came from, or how it was formed. Naturally, I had my heart set on getting a degree in geology before I'd even entered into high school, and a few blissful years of immersing myself in my favorite subject, I decided I didn't want to leave. That's how I ended up becoming a research fellow at the University of New Mexico's Department of Earth and Planetary Sciences, with my specialty being field research. However, it was through my field research that I ended up going on the second caving trip that ended up changing my life. And unlike my first, which undoubtedly changed my life for the better, the second ended up changing it for the worse. In 2011, I was presented with the opportunity of a lifetime, a chance at conducting research in the Lechogillia cave system near Carlsbad, New Mexico. To understand why this was such an amazing opportunity for me, I have to give you a little bit of backstory regarding the cave's history, and since I feel like I've already given you my life story, I'll try to keep it as short and sweet as possible. Up until the mid-80s, geologists believed that Lechogillia was just a small, insignificant cave full of nothing but dry, dead-end passages. But in 1984, a group of cavers discovered that not only was Lechogillia actually the 8th longest cave system in the world, but it was the deepest in the entire United States. So far, geologists have mapped over 150 miles of caves and tunnels that extend almost half a mile beneath the earth, and it's still not completely explored. Access is limited to approved scientific researchers, survey and exploration teams, and it can sometimes take literally years for the Bureau of Land Management to grant permission to conduct a research assignment. Knowing that, I'm sure you can imagine my excitement when I hear that not only is it our department that's been granted permission, but I'm one of the first researchers to be chosen to conduct research. But even so, all was not set in stone and I had to jump through a bunch of hoops to guarantee my place on the team. As some of you might know, caving can be extremely dangerous, even to experienced field researchers such as myself. And with that in mind, each potential member of the field team was subjected to a rigorous medical examination to ensure that they were fit and well enough to be chosen. Obviously, this was for both insurance and security purposes, as no one with any underlying medical conditions could be allowed to potentially jeopardize such an important field trip. So, not only were we some of the brightest and best in our field, we were also some of the fittest and most mentally sound researchers in the entire United States. And we felt like the SEAL Team 6 of geologists or something, like we were the best of the best. But being the fittest and most competent couldn't stop what would happen to us down there in Lechogilia, and the events of that field trip had haunted me for almost 11 long years now. The field team consisted of myself, a fellow UNM researcher and longtime mentor named Nestor, and 2 other field researchers, one from LSU, another from UT Austin, both of which shall remain nameless for reasons that will become obvious. We met twice before our eventual drive over to White City, and each time I remember walking away thinking very highly of the 2 researchers from Texas and Louisiana. Both guys were true field geologists, had both passed the medical exams, and both seemed like they could handle the outdoors enough to camp in the Sierras for a week. So by the time it came for us to all meet up in White City, I felt very confident that the field trip was going to go off without a hitch. The plan was to hike from White City to the entrance of the Lechogilia cave system, set up camp just outside of it, then use the camp as our field HQ while spending several days working our way in and out of the cave, gradually getting deeper as the days went on. For the first few days, it was one of the most incredible field trips I've ever been on. The research was electric, the subject matter titanic, and the people I was with were all the very best at what they did. I think I soaked up more knowledge and experience from them in a few days than I had over the past 18 months. It was nothing short of heaven. Until the 4th day, when it all became a living nightmare. I should explain that on the 3rd day, our colleague from LSU went back into the caves after the day's work was done. We were all absolutely exhausted from the day's caving, but for some reason the guy from LSU wanted to head back into Lechogilia to head a little deeper into the tunnel that we hadn't explored yet. Generally speaking, solo caving is extremely frowned upon. It's seen as irresponsible and overly dangerous, as if you get stuck or trapped somewhere, there's no one to help you or report that you're missing. But since this guy was easily one of the most experienced cavers any of us had ever worked with, we figured he'd have the sense not to get himself into any dangerous situations. So, off he went, down into the caves to do a little extra research. He'd said that it'd be 2 hours at the most, and that he'd be back well before sundown. But those 2 hours came and went without any word from him. Like I said, he was very experienced, but after 2 hours became 3, and almost 4, we started getting pretty worried about him, and right before we were gearing up to head down into the cave after him, he suddenly reappeared, looking extremely pale. We asked if everything was okay, expecting to hear some story about a close call in a tunnel, something of that nature. But to our surprise, he told us that he was fine, and that he'd found something after exploring one of the caves that was very pertinent to our research. When we asked him what it was, and if he'd taken any pictures or video, he shook his head, saying if he knew he was going to run into it, he'd have brought a camera. We asked him again what it was that he'd seen, and after struggling to find the words, all he'd tell us was, "You guys gotta see this to believe it." For the final few hours that we were awake, we pressed him on exactly what it was, and the more he refused to put it into words, the more I found a deep suspicion growing inside of me. From my perspective, the idea that an experienced geologist and caver was simply incapable of describing what he saw is nothing short of impossible. And at the time, there was only one explanation for his behavior. He wanted to guard what he'd seen so he could gain personal prestige from the find. But there was also something very unsettling about his behavior, and that was how frightened he seemed to be as a result of his discovery. It was like he didn't want to show us because he was afraid of what might happen, but at the time, I simply dismissed this as a kind of selfish, greedy glory-seeking. But how wrong I was. That night, I woke up to the sound of a struggle in the tent that the LSU and the UT Austin researchers were sharing. At first, it just sounded like they were engaged in heated but hushed argument of some kind. But seconds later, I heard a yelp of what sounded like pain. I quickly woke Nestor from his sleep and told him what I was hearing, and when he heard some horrific sort of wheezing sound, he ran out of our tent and over to the other. When he pulled open the flap, he saw the LSU researcher strangling the guy from UT Austin with his bare hands. It took all our strength to separate them, but by then, it was far too late. The UT researcher had since suffered irreparable brain damage as a result of oxygen starvation, and it's more likely that he'll never walk or eat unassisted for the remainder of his life. The LSU researcher was impossible to restrain, even once we pulled him off the other researcher. We tried everything we could to restrain him, but in the end, Nestor was left with a split lip and my nose was completely shattered after he'd slammed his forehead into my face. After he broke from our grip, we're almost certain that he ran back into the cave without any food, water, or protective clothing. And that is the last time we ever saw him. We were in no rush to pursue him. After all, we didn't think that he could just up and disappear in there. Even if all the tunnels are unexplored, there's still a limited amount of space where a person might try to hide themselves. Our focus was getting the UT Austin researcher the medical attention he needed, but even so, we just couldn't get him to a hospital in time. As for the LSU researcher, his body was never recovered. At least, I'm assuming they were looking for a body, as there's no way that a person could survive down there for long, not without ample supplies of food and water, neither of which he took with him when he ran off into the night. To this day, we don't know what he saw down there, or what happened in the run-up to him strangling our colleague from UT Austin. The cops interviewed him when he woke up from the coma, but using some of the most advanced communication devices available, none of what he communicated made any sense. What happened that night has haunted me for years, but mainly because it remains an almost complete mystery. There's only one thing I'm certain of, though, and that's whatever caused the violent outburst, it was caused by something the LSU researcher had seen down in the Lechagillia cave system. And whatever it was, despite all my collegiate curiosity, I sincerely hope it stays buried forever. A few years back, I was on a hiking, camping, canoeing trip up near the boundary waters between Minnesota and Canada. And trust me, these aren't your normal backyard ponds. For those that don't already know, the boundary waters are these thousands of huge lakes that are all interconnected with each other, and they're basically the holy grail if you're canoeing. About a week into our trip, we were still pretty much playing things by ear, and we didn't really have an itinerary. We just planned to go wherever the wind took us, fishing for our food and otherwise live off the land for about 2 weeks. We had a GPS and a sat phone to call a helicopter for pickup whenever we were done, which cost us quite a bit of money, but was worth every freaking penny for those wondering if they should arrange it. Anyway, we're about a week in and we're set to canoe a few hours to the next lake. An hour or so in, we're in the middle of this long, narrow lake, and to our horror, we see the storm starting to form on the horizon. Someone pulls out their binoculars and they call out that the waves on the lake are easily hitting 2 feet plus high, which is way, way too much for our dinky canoes. To avoid getting absolutely destroyed by the storm, we pull off to some random clearing on the shore and set up a quick camp so we don't get ourselves and our supplies totally soaked. We then eat some cold food before being forced to stay in our tents for what turned out to be a pretty boring, rainy night. Thankfully, by the next morning the whole thing had blown over, leaving us with a pretty serene day of sunshine to enjoy. In light of that, we figured that we'd take the opportunity to get a little fishing done while we had the best chance of catching some lunch for that day. With that in mind, we gather up our fishing gear and start walking down the shore to find ourselves a good fishing spot. We walk for maybe half a mile before, out of nowhere, we come across yet another campsite, one we had no idea was there the night before. They had a similar setup to ours, a few tents and a campfire in the middle, with the canoes being used to store supplies with the seat covers over them. Only, unlike our camp, this one was absolutely trashed. There was torn up garbage strewn everywhere, the tents were all ripped up and collapsed, spare clothing was all soaked and just lying there on the ground. Our first thoughts were, who leaves a camp like this? Absolute jerks. Because good outdoors folk never ever do stuff like that. Leave nothing but your boot prints, as the old saying goes. We started looking around for anything to ID the people that had done it, but then the more we looked, the more we noticed that something was kind of off about the whole scene. Firstly, their garbage was still hoisted into a tree to keep it safe from bears, which is Campcraft 101 out here. But these guys had it like 20 to 25 feet up in the air, which is actually maybe going overboard a little. It showed that they were way more responsible than we first thought, but then the whole bag had been ripped open, and unless a black bear climbed a tree then ninja jumped out to the branch, we couldn't see how a bear could have done that at all. Second thing was that literally everything except the canoes were still at the campsite. It looked like all their clothes, packs, food, rope, and pans were still there, enough for at least 2 or 3 people. Half of it was trashed and torn open, mostly the packs, tents, and clothes. The other half was totally untouched but thrown on the ground. To us, it looked like whoever was camped there had just bailed in the middle of the night for some reason, freaked out enough to just ditch hundreds of bucks worth of gear without so much as a second thought. But then, what in God's name could have happened to make them get so scared? I mean, we didn't hear or experience anything during the previous night, so what happened only half a mile away in the middle of that storm, and how close were we to it happening to us instead? Needless to say, we're all thoroughly creeped out at this point, so we call into our helicopter crew. They had access to some pretty powerful radio equipment, and they monitored the emergency frequencies too, so we were pretty sure that they'd have known if someone had a serious emergency out there. And we were all pretty surprised when they said that they hadn't heard anything. But then again, if people at that campsite had just bailed like it seemed that they did, there's a chance that they left their radio, their satellite phone, or even cell phones behind with them too. Besides, if something really bad had happened that night, something life-ending, then that would explain why no one had called it in. Eventually, we just left everything and moved camp. Everybody was pretty upset by it, and a day or two later, we ended the whole trip early because it seemed like nobody wanted to be out anymore. I mean, myself included, there was no way I wanted to be out there with stuff like that going on. Every single one of us was extremely unsettled, and we just couldn't seem to focus our minds on anything else. It was without a doubt the single most creepiest thing I'd ever seen on a camping trip before. And what's just as messed up is that we didn't get a single ounce of closure from it. To this day, we're all still in the dark about it, and there's a number of things that still weigh on my mind. At first, we all thought it was just a bear attack. I say just a bear attack, and I know those are obviously really bad, but stuff just didn't make sense enough to line up with that theory. For starters, bears tend not to leave any food uneaten. Even black bears, the smallest kind, have one heck of an appetite when it comes to free food, so it makes absolutely zero sense considering that there was so much untouched food left over at the camp. On top of that, bears are actually super easy to scare away during the time of year our trip was. When they have cubs with them, or just after hibernation, that's when things get nasty. But we deliberately timed our trip not to coincide with either of those times. Then why were all their clothes and stuff torn up? And how did something get high enough to reach the garbage strung up in the tree like that? I mean, it's not impossible that a black bear could have ninja'd its way out to a branch, but It'd have to be the most desperate, rabid black bear in the history of black bears. I've done a lot of other camping and hiking, rafting and biking all around the country, and although I've definitely seen and experienced some crazy, adrenaline-pumping stuff, nothing I've ever seen or experienced has left me so completely creeped out before. I hope I never run into anything like that again, but more importantly, I hope whatever did that to that camp stays far, far away from anywhere I am. Long-time listener from Wales in the UK here, and honestly, I actually hope I'd never have to have a reason to write you. For a long time, I haven't, and I suppose that was only a good thing. But that all changed this past week when I took my dog, Arth, on a hike in Carn Ingley, here in my native Pembrokeshire. Because I'm a nurse, I work very odd hours, so I don't get to spend enough quality time with him as I'd like. So whenever I get the chance, I drive up to Carn Ingley to go on what I like to call a mega walk, which is basically just a hike. Just a bit of explanation. Carn Ingley is one of the more dominant summits of the Preseli Hills, and is well known for its Iron Age fort. Also, local folklore has it that a local saint used to climb Carn Ingley to commune with angels. It makes sense that someone would climb the hill for a bit of peace and quiet, but some people used to claim that the saint used to literally talk to the spirits up there, as it's a place where the barriers between our world and the hereafter are at their thinnest. I used to think that was a load of dooley, which is a Welsh word for nonsense, and that there was nothing remotely spooky or dangerous about the place. But after mine and Arth's hike last Monday, I'm not so sure anymore. So last Monday, after working a 14-hour shift, I got home from work at about noon. I had a few hours sleep, then my mom drove over with Arth as she'd been looking after him for the weekend. I'd missed him so much, but my crazy shift pattern meant that keeping him at home would have been downright neglectful, so as exhausted as I was just dying to get some quality time in with him. He was so excited to see me too, like he was yapping and almost doing backflips in the boot of my mom's car when I met them in the driveway. So that sight alone was the equivalent of about 20 cups of coffee for me. After that, me and my mom had a chinwag over a cup of tea, then I had Arth hop into my car and we drove the 40 minutes or so up to Carn Ingley. It was about 7:30 by the time we got there, but the sun had been setting at about 9:30 in the evening over the past few weeks, so I knew we had a few hours of daylight left before we'd have to start walking back to the car. Plus, because you get a really nice look at the Irish Sea to the west, the sunsets are nothing short of amazing up in Carn Ingley. The sky gets all pink and orange at first, then the sky fades to a baby blue, then to a navy blue, before getting darker and darker until it's night. So maybe that's the reason I decided to spend a little too long up there when we should have been heading back. There was no danger of us getting lost either, as I must have walked the trails back to the car park at least a dozen times during the daytime, so between my knowledge of the area and the torch on my phone, I knew that we'd get back to the car safe and soundly. But then, about halfway back to the car, Arth starts barking at something on the other side of a hedge. Arth barks at pretty much everything, and every time he does, I just put his lead on him to make sure that he doesn't go chasing it. Could be a squirrel, could be a rabbit or a cat, or even another dog, but it usually results in a few barks, and then Arth starts to calm down again. I couldn't see what it was that he was barking at, but they just didn't die down after a few seconds. They actually got more and more intense and loud. It got to the point where Arth was pulling on the lead so hard that he was choking himself, trying to get to whatever was on the other side of the hedge so he could attack it or what have you. I got a bit worried that he ended up breaking the lead. He was honestly pulling that hard on it, but then out of nowhere, he stops pulling and actually darts behind me, like he was the one who needed protection. Arth isn't afraid of anything, so the fact that he suddenly started acting like that was very, very unsettling to me. I started asking him what was wrong, kneeling down and trying to comfort him. I was so confused as to why he was acting that way that I actually thought that he might have stood on something sharp that was concealed in the grass or something, that maybe some teenagers had been drinking on the footpath and smashed a glass bottle. It wasn't completely dark yet, so I started to check his paws to see if there was blood on any of them or if he'd yelp if I tried to touch them. But he didn't. He just kept lying there whining. Then, when I was checking his back paws, I noticed that he was actually weeing on himself. Not cocking a leg like he normally would, just weeing on the ground as he was laying there, with his wee soaking into his fur. I've never seen him act like that before, ever, and I've had him for almost 4 years at the time of writing this. Something was absolutely scaring the life out of him, something he could smell or hear, but something I definitely couldn't see. And that's when it occurred to me that if it was scaring him, then it definitely should have been scaring me. There was no rustling bushes, no growls or anything coming from the other side of the hedge, but there honestly didn't need to be for me to be bloody certain that I wanted to get away from there. So we did, and as soon as I gave Arth's lead a tug to let him know that it was time to leave, he just about bolted back in the direction of my car, dragging on the lead the whole way. I ended up jogging just to keep up with him and so the lead wouldn't choke him so much. The noises he was making were so distressing, these horrible wheezing noises like he didn't care if he passed out from the choking, just as long as he could get to a safe distance from whatever had scared him so much. By the time we got back to the car, I think I'd run about 1.5 miles non-stop, more than I'd ever run since I did cross-country in school, and I was honestly ready to throw up. Arthur was scratching at the door of my car, begging to get in so we could get out of there, and believe me, I was in no mood to hang around. The whole drive back home, I kept wondering what it was that could have scared him so much, and the moment I got home, I started looking at what kind of wild animals could have been in those bushes that would have made him freak out like that. When I looked it up online, the only thing that could have possibly been any threat to him is a buzzard. We don't get any wildcats or anything like that around here, but then what in God's name could have a buzzard been doing sitting in a bush? And I honestly don't think Arth would have been that scared of one even if he'd seen it up close or in the daytime. I'm still shaken up about the whole thing a week later, and I thought writing all this down to send to you might help me A, work out what was happening, and B, help me to calm down about it, but it doesn't seem to have done any good on either point. The only thing I'm certain of is that I don't want to go around Carn Ingley anytime soon, especially not after dark. I'm not saying that it was some weird monster or anything remotely supernatural, but whatever was happening, it scared my poor Arth enough to make him completely freak out, which I feel is a pretty good indicator that we were definitely in some kind of danger. But that's what makes me unable to get it off my mind, and what keeps me going back to Google to look what could have happened. As crazy as it sounds, a woman claimed to have been chased by a wolf in North Wales in 2013, and since 2011, there have been 10 different reports of people spotting big cats that look like panthers, puma, or a lynx. An article from this year says that there have been puma sightings in Wales as recently as January, and that people have been hearing roars at night when taking their dogs for walks. I'm convinced I had a close encounter with that exact same type of big cat. There's literally no other logical explanation for it. I know what people say about Carn Ingley, how weird things happen there all the time, but I'm not naive enough to believe that it was anything supernatural when there's actual photos of some giant black puma thing roaming around. Just Google big cats of Wales, and it's the first thing that comes up. So how close was I to getting attacked that night, and if I did get ambushed by some hungry puma, I don't think Arth would have been in any position to defend me. If you ask me, someone needs to do something about it before someone gets hurt, and the fact that people are dismissing the whole thing as just silly rumors is literally going to get someone hurt, or get their pet killed. Born on November 22nd of 1946 in Atlanta, Georgia, Gary Michael Hilton grew up to hold one of the most prestigious positions in the entire U.S. Army. At just 18 years old, he was assigned to a Davy Crockett platoon, a special experimental unit that was equipped with the Davy Crockett missile, the smallest and lightest nuclear weapon ever developed by the United States military. With a maximum range of just over a mile, the platoons would form a seemingly impenetrable perimeter across West Germany and would unleash a devastating conflagration of nuclear fire on the orders of none other than the U.S. President. With such powerful weapons in their hands, members of the Davy Crockett platoon had to be some of the most mentally stable soldiers in the entire military, and were regularly screened for psychological fitness. Which begs the question, how in God's name was Gary Hilton selected? When Gary was just 13 years old, resentment for his stepfather boiled over in spectacular fashion when Gary shot him with a small caliber pistol. He believed that Nilo DeBag was attempting to take his mother away from him, and this marked the first time that Gary attempted to take the life of another human being. It seems Nilo had the patience of a saint because, for some reason, he decided not to press charges and gave his violent stepson a second chance. Gary didn't completely get away with the attempt on Nilo's life, however, and briefly spent some time in a mental hospital so his violent tendencies could be addressed. Upon his release, he meandered through the remainder of his mid-teens until finally joining the Army. Being a member of the Davy Crockett units came with considerable bragging rights, but it also came with some serious mental stressors. In all likelihood, a full-scale Soviet invasion of Europe would be preceded by the deployment of tactical nuclear weapons. And given that the Crockett platoons would be on the very front lines if the Cold War ever turned hot, it was more than probable that they would be some of the first military personnel to die. Many suffered full-on mental breakdowns as a result of this stress, and Gary was no different. By the time he was 20, he began to hear voices which seemed to originate inside his own skull. And by 21, Gary had been officially diagnosed with schizophrenia. For the second time in his life, Gary was confined to a mental hospital, where Army doctors began to dose him with Thorazine, a powerful antipsychotic medication. It soon became clear that Gary was no longer fit to serve in the military, but instead of giving him the proper Section 8 discharge, the Army instead gave him an honorable one, meaning no record of Gary's medical conditions followed him into civilian life. Gary was a handsome, athletic, and intelligent young man, but readjusting to civilian life was something he found incredibly difficult. It was hard for him to build or maintain personal relationships, and holding down a job was almost impossible. As a result, Gary moved around the southern states for the better part of 20 years, and after a series of failed marriages, he moved back to Atlanta at the age of 54 and found work as a roofer. To say that Gary was dissatisfied with life would be an understatement, but to alleviate the stress and melancholy of the daily grind, he took solace in his love for the outdoors. He'd often hit the road in his Dodge Astro with his dog Dandy in tow and head up into North Carolina, specifically to the Pisgah National Forest just outside of Asheville. It was there, in 2007, that Gary first encountered two senior citizens by the name of Irene and John Bryant. And it was there, among the ancient, old-growth oaks of the Appalachian wilderness, that Gary decided to kill them. Shortly after the Bryants went hiking on October 20th of 2007, they seemed to drop off the face of the earth. In late October, someone used the couple's ATM card at a bank more than 75 miles away, which initially threw investigators off the scene. However, Irene's bloated corpse was discovered 3 weeks later on November 9th, with her skull being fractured in multiple places. Her husband's corpse was found roughly a year later, the discovery delayed by its rapid state of decomposition. After killing them, Gary stopped to set up a camp on a private hunting preserve in Georgia's Cherokee County. Given that it was private, his presence was reported to local police, and a deputy soon arrived and asked Gary to move on. It was a matter of protocol to run a potential offender's license through a state database, but not the federal one. And if the deputy had done this, he'd have discovered that Gary had an outstanding warrant for a 2005 unanswered citation. He'd have been arrested, and there's no doubt that lives would have been saved as a result. After leaving Cherokee County, Hilton headed south into Florida and entered the Apalachicola National Forest outside Tallahassee in mid-November. It was here that he encountered a 46-year-old nurse named Cheryl Dunlap on December 1st of that same year. Standing at 5'4", Cheryl had thick, wavy brown hair and deep brown eyes. She was a mother and a devoted member of the Evangelical River of Life Church, but none of that mattered to Gary. Shortly after her disappearance, her car was found parked on Crawfordville Highway, just outside the Apalachicola Park's entrance. Since it had a flat tire, it speculated that Cheryl had been attempting to flag someone down when she came to Gary's attention. But instead of offering her assistance, Gary gave her only death. A few days after she disappeared, investigators' attentions were drawn to some security camera footage which showed a man in a rubber mask attempting to use Dunlap's bank card at a nearby ATM. Then, on December 15th, the presence of circling buzzards allowed park rangers to pinpoint her lifeless body. There were gaping wounds in the torso and legs, both hands had been cut off, and Cheryl had been decapitated. Gary was back in Georgia in time for New Year's Day, when he and his dog set out for a hike on the aptly named Blood Mountain outside of Atlanta. This is where he ran into 24-year-old Meredith Emerson, a University of Georgia French graduate who was also enjoying a New Year's Day hike. Meredith initially resisted Gary's attempts to abduct her, but despite her martial arts training, she was unable to fight off her formidable opponent for long. Once subdued, Meredith was frog-marched down the mountain to where Gary had parked his van. Once inside, she was tied up and held prisoner for days on end. Yet the abduction was not without witnesses, and those who saw the suspicious sight of a young woman being forced into a van swiftly contacted the relevant authorities. As news of the abduction swept the nation, it quickly caught the attention of a man named John Tabor, Gary's former employer. Shockingly, Gary actually called John Tabor in the aftermath of Meredith's abduction, asking him for an advance on his upcoming paycheck. Tabor reported the call to the police almost immediately, allowing them to trace it to a pancake house off of Blood Mountain. But by the time they arrived, Gary and Meredith were long gone. A few days later, in Georgia's DeKalb County, Gary was spotted in a parking lot, removing items out of his van and tossing them into a dumpster. Seeing as his picture was all over the news, a member of the public quickly recognized him, and they contacted the local police. Sheriff's deputies rushed to the scene, lights and sirens blaring, giving Gary no time to escape. He must have known the jig was up, as he offered no resistance as police put him into custody. Within an hour or so, Gary was in a police interview room, giving full and frank confession almost immediately and seeking to make a deal with investigators. In exchange for his confession, as well as leading police to Meredith's body, Gary would swap the death penalty for life in prison without the possibility of parole. A few days later, while under heavy police escort, Gary led authorities to a remote road in Dawson Forest, just over 30 miles south of Blood Mountain. There, he showed them to Meredith's shallow grave. Just like with Cheryl Dunlap's corpse, Meredith had been decapitated. When asked why he committed such an obscene act of mutilation, Gary answered that it was simply to obscure identification. Yet just as police in Georgia were piecing together the murder of Meredith Emerson, Florida law enforcement were doing the same with Cheryl Dunlap, and through shared information, they determined that the woman's killer was the exact same man. But unlike authorities up in Georgia, a deal was most certainly not on the table in Florida. In fact, they had a fast track on the death penalty at the time of Cheryl's murder. There was no question that Florida would seek to execute Gary Hilton for his crimes, but the question remained over whether or not Gary was simply evil, or if his life experiences had twisted him into one. A journalist met up with a childhood friend of Gary's named Dino Sclafani. Dino spoke of a band that Gary had played in during his high school years, and how he had showed genuine talent and thoughtfulness. One of Gary's former girlfriends was also contacted, but she had a far darker tale to tell. She told the journalist that Gary once confessed to having an incestuous relationship with his mother while he was just a child, and how that could have contributed to his apparent hatred for women. In February 2011, after 2 years of pretrial hearings, Gary was convicted of first-degree murder and officially given the death sentence. Yet unlike his victims, who were condemned to death at the very moment Gary lay eyes on them, the universe would find a perverse judicial way in which to show him mercy. In January 2016, Associate Justice Sonia Sotomayor declared Florida's death sentence fast-track to be unconstitutional. Suddenly, all executions in Florida, including Gary's, were put on hold. The Florida legislature is currently drafting a new law in accordance with the U.S. Supreme Court decision, and until then, Gary Hilton simply has to sit and stew in vicious uncertainty, just as Meredith Emerson did during her time in captivity, when she wondered if the hike on Blood Mountain would be her last. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. If you get a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/letsreadofficial, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks offered for the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories and big compilations and save huge on data, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. Links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember to finish your chicken talons.